It is impossible at this point to say exactly where we'll be at in November with the pandemic. Will we be free to vote in person as we have in past elections? We don't know for sure, but states and the federal government are beginning to look ahead to what changes can be made to provide access to the vote. And one option that's being talked about quite a bit is mail voting. There are a number of proponents of it that are pushing it as a solution, both in the upcoming primaries as well as the general election, while the president has been talking about his concerns involving massive fraud that it could lead to. Well, I'm not an expert on mail-in voting, so we are going to an expert on some of these reforms that are being talked about. David Becker, Executive Director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here, and I very much enjoyed your recent op-ed in the Washington Post about this.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is trying to figure out how we're going to hold an election during a pandemic. I mean, it is obviously something that is of great concern. I can tell you, although it seems like something, given what the president is saying and others, that is highly polarized along partisan lines, the election officials in the states, I mean, Republican election officials, Democratic election officials are all trying to figure this out. And they all know part of the solution is going to be moving to more mail voting, more, depending upon where they are now, that might mean over 50%, it might be less than 50%, and also a mix of early voting and in-person voting on election day to try to spread out as much voting across as many different modes as possible so people aren't congregated together in case the pandemic is continuing in November.
So I want to talk about some of the concerns around it, which I think can be sorted into valid concerns from people who actually care about this and invalid concerns. Let's start there. How worried are you that widespread mail-in voting could lead to a dramatic rise in voter fraud or, uncertainty of whether election outcomes can actually be trusted?
Not very concerned at all. I mean, the states that have voter fraud that have vote by mail all across the country, including a lot of Western states, high percentage of vote by mail. What they found is there are protections in place to make sure that those ballots are cast legally, that there is very little fraud. We know from looking at election fraud across the United States that despite what some say, voter fraud is extremely rare. When it happens, it's detectable and it's prosecuted, but it happens very, very rarely. And that's true for mail ballots as well as in-person ballots. So I don't think that's a real concern. I think if you ask the 6 states where the highest percentage of mail ballots were cast in 2018, all of them were run by Republican chief election officials in 2018, and all of them saw a high level of integrity and virtually no fraud. And
so you do list in your op-ed, though, some concerns, including that mail-in voting might have some demographic differences in terms of how likely different groups are to actually participate in that. So how do you see that shaking out in practice?
Right. Different voters have different preferences when they choose to vote. And we have to remember that a presidential election is the time when the largest percentage of infrequent voters participate. People who are not well versed in the process, might not know their election officials, might not know where they're normally supposed to vote, might not be used to filling out a ballot. And what we see, and I've led some of this research, as have others, we see some demographic differences, particularly between old and young. Older voters prefer to vote by mail, and younger voters prefer to vote in person. There are some studies, including some I've conducted, that indicate there may be some demographic disparities based on race, that African American and Hispanic voters may prefer to vote in person at higher rates than whites. That's not a reason not to move to more mail voting for those that choose to vote that way. Mail voting can be really good. I'm a big supporter of mail voting, expanding it as an option for voters. But it just means that we have to be very aware to make sure there are some really meaningful ways to vote in person for those that would prefer to do it that way, and make sure that those methods are safe for those that are not risking their health.
And I also want to let people know, if you're watching this, that we're going to be providing a link to the op-ed in the description. If you are watching it elsewhere and want to search for it, it is titled Mail-in Ballots to Avoid Coronavirus. Yes, but here's how to minimize chaos and unfairness, available through the Washington Post. David Becker, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.